Have you ever wondered what it feels like to lose everything that matters in a single moment, only to discover years later that a piece of what you lost is still alive, beating in someone else's chest? I never imagined that a routine visit to my daughter's grave would turn into the most emotionally devastating and beautiful experience of my entire life. And what I'm about to share with you will change the way you think about loss, hope, and the incredible connections that bind us all together in ways we can never predict. My name is irrelevant to this story, but what happened to me on that cold November morning will stay with me until my last breath. And I need to tell you about it because maybe, just maybe, you'll understand why I believe that even in our darkest moments, there's a light we cannot see, a purpose we cannot comprehend, and a love that transcends even death itself. It was a Tuesday morning, and I remember the exact date because it was 3 years to the day since I lost Emma, my beautiful 7-year-old daughter who had been the center of my universe, the reason I woke up every morning with a smile, the little girl who would run to me when I came home from work and throw her tiny arms around my neck like I was the most important person in the world. I had built an empire in the business world, climbed every ladder there was to climb, made more money than I could ever spend, but none of it mattered anymore. None of it could fill the gaping void that her absence had left in my soul. Every Tuesday morning for 3 years, I would leave my office early, drive to Riverside Cemetery on the outskirts of the city, and spend an hour sitting beside her grave, talking to her as if she could hear me, telling her about my week, about the things I wished I could share with her, about how much I missed her laugh, her questions, her endless curiosity about everything. The grief had become a companion I carried everywhere, a weight that never lightened, and my wife Sarah had left me 2 years ago because she said I had become a ghost myself, living but not really alive, going through the motions of existence without truly participating in life. She wasn't wrong, and I didn't blame her for leaving, because how could I explain to her that every time I looked at her, I saw Emma in her eyes, in her smile, in the way she moved through our home that had once been filled with the sound of our daughter's laughter. The divorce was quiet, civilized, and utterly heartbreaking in its own way. But I understood that people grieve differently, and Sarah needed to move forward while I seemed determined to stay frozen in that moment 3 years ago, when the police officer knocked on my door at 2 a.m. to tell me there had been an accident. I had memorized every detail of Emma's grave over these 3 years, knew exactly where the sunlight would hit in the morning, could tell you which flowers the groundskeepers planted each season, had watched the oak tree nearby grow taller and stronger while I felt myself growing smaller and weaker with each passing day. The headstone was simple, elegant, with her name, her dates, and the inscription, "Forever our little light," that Sarah and I had chosen together during those first horrible days when we had to make decisions no parent should ever have to make. I would bring fresh flowers every week, usually sunflowers because those had been her favorite, and I would sit on the bench I had donated to the cemetery, positioned just a few feet from her resting place, and I would read to her from the books she had loved, tell her stories about the business deals I was making, ask her advice as if she could somehow guide me from wherever she was. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as I drove through the cemetery gates with my usual bouquet of sunflowers on the passenger seat beside me, I noticed something different, something that made my heart skip a beat and my hands tighten on the steering wheel. There were people at Emma's grave, 2 figures that I could see even from a distance, and my first reaction was confusion mixed with an unexpected surge of territorial anger, because this was my time with my daughter, my sacred space. And who were these strangers intruding on the most private, painful part of my life? I parked my car in my usual spot, grabbed the flowers, and walked quickly across the manicured lawn, my expensive leather shoes getting damp from the morning dew, my mind racing with questions and a strange anxiety I couldn't quite name. As I got closer, I could see them more clearly now, and what I saw made me slow my pace, made something twist in my chest in a way I hadn't felt in 3 years. There was a woman, maybe in her early 30s, wearing nurse scrubs under a light jacket, and she was kneeling beside Emma's grave, her shoulders shaking with sobs that I could hear even from 20 feet away. Next to her stood a young boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, thin and pale with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of illness or exhaustion, and he had his small hand on the woman's shoulder as if he was trying to comfort her, even though tears were streaming down his own face. They hadn't noticed me yet, so absorbed were they in their grief, and I stood there frozen, watching these strangers cry at my daughter's grave, feeling a mix of emotions I couldn't even begin to process. The nurse was saying something I couldn't quite hear, her voice broken and thick with emotion, and the boy was nodding, wiping at his eyes with the sleeve of his oversized hoodie. I saw that they had brought flowers too, white roses that they had placed carefully beside the headstone, and there was something about the tenderness of that gesture, something about the genuine anguish in their tears, that made me hesitate before announcing my presence. Who were they? How did they know Emma? Why were they here, mourning my daughter with an intensity that seemed too deep, too personal for strangers? My business mind, trained to analyze and strategize, was working overtime trying to make sense of this puzzle, but my heart, my broken, grieving heart, was simply confused and somehow, inexplicably, moved by the scene before me. I cleared my throat, and both of them jumped, startled by my presence, and the nurse quickly stood up, wiping at her face with her hands, looking embarrassed and afraid, as if I had caught her doing something wrong. The boy stepped back, closer to the woman, and I could see fear in his eyes, the kind of fear that children get when they think they're in trouble, and something about that look made my voice come out softer than I had intended when I finally spoke. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, hearing my own voice sound strange and formal, the voice of the businessman rather than the grieving father. "But I'm Emma's father. This is my daughter's grave." The words felt heavy in my mouth, and I saw the nurse's face go pale, saw her reach out to steady herself on the headstone, and the boy's eyes went wide with a look I couldn't quite read, something between shock and wonder and a desperate kind of hope. "Oh my God," the nurse whispered, and her voice was trembling so badly I could barely understand her. "I'm so sorry, I'm so incredibly sorry, we didn't mean to intrude, I needed to come here. I needed to—" And then she broke down again, sobbing so hard that her whole body was shaking, and I found myself stepping forward instinctively, the same way I would have if I had seen anyone in such obvious distress, business training and social conditioning overriding my own confusion and pain. The boy was looking up at me now with an expression that was making my chest feel tight, and I realized with a start that there was something familiar about him, something in the shape of his face or the way he was looking at me that triggered a memory I couldn't quite grasp, like trying to remember a dream that fades the moment you wake up. "Please," I said, and I was surprised to find that I genuinely meant it. "Don't apologize, but can you tell me, how did you know my daughter? Why are you here?" The nurse looked at the boy, and some silent communication passed between them, and then she took a deep breath, steadying herself, and when she looked back at me, her eyes were filled with something that looked like gratitude and sorrow and a kind of desperate need to explain. "My name is Jennifer," she said, her voice still shaky but stronger now, "and this is Michael. I was working in the emergency room the night your daughter was brought in. I was one of the nurses who tried to save her life." The words hit me like a physical blow, and I actually took a step back, feeling the air leave my lungs in a rush, because I had never thought about the medical staff who had been there that night, had never considered that there were people who had fought for Emma's life, who had witnessed her last moments, who might carry their own grief about failing to save her. 3 years, Jennifer continued, and now the words were coming faster, like she had been holding them in for so long that they were pouring out of her all at once. 3 years I've been coming here, every month, sometimes more, because I can't forget her. I can't forget any of them but your daughter. She was special. She fought so hard even at the end, and I held her hand when you couldn't be there yet, and I promised her that she would be okay, even though I knew. Her voice broke again, and she covered her face with her hands, and I felt tears burning in my own eyes because here was someone else who had been touched by Emma's life, someone else who carried the weight of her loss, and somehow knowing that made my own grief feel less isolating, less like a burden I had to carry alone. Have you ever experienced something that completely shattered your understanding of the world and forced you to see everything differently? That moment standing in the cemetery, looking at this nurse who had been carrying her own grief about my daughter for 3 years, I felt something crack open inside me, some wall I had built to protect myself from feeling too much, and I didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified of what might come flooding in. The boy, Michael, was still watching me with those intense eyes, and I realized he hadn't said a word yet, was just standing there like he was waiting for something, like he had his own story to tell but didn't know how to begin. The morning sun was getting stronger now, burning off the mist that had been hovering over the cemetery, and I could hear birds singing in the oak tree, and somewhere in the distance, a groundskeeper was starting a lawnmower, and all of these ordinary sounds were happening while my entire world was shifting beneath my feet. "There's more," Jennifer said, and her voice was barely above a whisper now, and she reached out to take Michael's hand, holding it tightly like she needed his strength to continue. "I need to tell you something. Something I've wanted to tell you for so long, but I didn't know how to find you. Didn't know if I had the right to disrupt your grief with this information." She paused, looking down at Michael and then back at me, and I saw something in her eyes that made my heart start to race, made some instinct deep inside me know that whatever she was about to say was going to change everything. "Your daughter was an organ donor," she said, and the words hung in the air between us, heavy with meaning. And I nodded slowly because, yes, I knew this. Sarah and I had made that decision together in those horrible hours after the doctors told us there was no hope, told us that Emma's brain had been too damaged by the impact, that she would never wake up, that the machines were the only thing keeping her body alive. "We donated everything we could," I heard myself say, my voice sounding hollow and distant. "Her heart, her kidneys, her liver, her corneas. The doctors said she could save lives, and it was the only thing that made any sense in all of that senselessness. The only good that could come from such a terrible tragedy." I had tried not to think too much about it over the years, had tried not to imagine the people who had received parts of my daughter, because the thought was too strange, too uncomfortable, made me feel like Emma had been taken apart and scattered to the winds, and I couldn't bear to think of her that way. But Jennifer was nodding, and she was pulling Michael closer to her, and the boy was looking up at me now with tears streaming down his face, and suddenly, with a clarity that took my breath away, I understood why they were here, understood what she was about to tell me, and I felt my knees go weak with the realization. "This is Michael," Jennifer said again, and her voice was filled with such tenderness, such love, such profound emotion that I could barely stand to hear it. "He's my nephew, my sister's son, and 3 years ago he was dying. His heart was failing, had been failing since he was born, and he had been on the transplant list for 2 years, and every day we were losing hope, watching him get weaker and sicker, knowing that time was running out." She paused, and I could see her struggling to maintain her composure, could see the boy squeezing her hand back, and I was frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to do anything but listen as my entire understanding of the last 3 years was rewritten. "Your daughter saved his life," Jennifer whispered, and now she was crying again, and Michael was crying. And I realized that tears were running down my own face, too. Michael received Emma's heart. "Your daughter's heart is beating in my nephew's chest, has been keeping him alive for 3 years, and I brought him here today because he's been asking to come, has been asking to see the grave of the little girl who gave him life, and I thought it was time." The world seemed to tilt on its axis, and I actually had to sit down on the bench, had to lower myself carefully, because I wasn't sure my legs would hold me anymore. Michael received Emma's heart. Emma's heart was still beating, was still alive, was still in this world, just in a different body, in this thin, pale boy who was looking at me with Emma's eyes. No, not with her eyes, but with something that reminded me of her anyway. Something in the intensity of his gaze, the depth of feeling I could see there. I tried to speak, tried to form words, but nothing would come out. And Jennifer was kneeling in front of me now, her hands on my knees, looking up at me with such concern, such fear that I might react badly, might reject this information, might send them away. "Can I—" Michael's voice was small and uncertain, the first words I had heard him speak, and he was looking at me with such hope, such desperate hope, that I felt my heart breaking and healing at the same time. "Can I tell you about her? About your daughter's heart?" And I nodded, unable to speak, unable to do anything but nod, and the boy came closer, so close I could see every detail of his face, could see the scars on his chest where they must have opened him up to give him Emma's heart, could see the flush of color in his cheeks that spoke of blood pumping properly, of life, of survival. "Sometimes I can feel it," he said, his voice getting stronger now, more confident. "I can feel her. The doctors say it's not possible, say it's just my imagination, but I swear I can feel her spirit or something, especially when I'm scared or sad. It's like she's telling me it's going to be okay, like she's protecting me from inside." I reached out without thinking, my hand moving of its own accord, and I placed it gently on Michael's chest, right over his heart, right over my daughter's heart, and I felt it, strong and steady and alive, that rhythmic beating that I used to feel when Emma was a baby, and I would hold her against my chest when she was scared at night and would crawl into my bed and press her little body against mine, and I could feel her heartbeat then too, could feel that proof of life, that essence of her being. And now here it was again, that same heart, that same rhythm, in this boy who was a complete stranger but who was also, in some impossible, miraculous way, connected to me and to Emma in the most profound way possible. I couldn't stop the sob that tore from my throat, couldn't contain the flood of emotions that came crashing over me, and I was crying harder than I had cried since the funeral, crying with a mixture of grief and joy and wonder and pain that I had no words for, no way to express except through these tears that wouldn't stop falling. Jennifer put her arms around both of us, and we stood there, the three of us in front of Emma's grave, crying together. And it was strange and beautiful and terrible all at once. I felt Michael's thin arms wrap around my waist, felt him hugging me with a strength I wouldn't have expected from someone so small, and I held him back, held him tight, feeling that heartbeat against my own chest now, feeling my daughter's heart beating between us, and it was the most profound moment of my entire life, more profound than the day Emma was born, more profound than anything I had achieved in my business career, more profound than I had imagined anything could ever be. Time seemed to stop, or maybe it expanded, and I was aware of everything and nothing all at once. Aware of the warmth of the sun on my back, the smell of freshly cut grass, the sound of Michael's breathing, the feeling of his small body pressed against mine, and underneath it all, that steady, faithful beating of the heart that had once belonged to my daughter. When we finally pulled apart, I felt different, felt like something fundamental had shifted inside me, like I had been living in black and white for 3 years, and suddenly the world had color again. Jennifer was watching me carefully, anxiety written all over her face, and I realized she was still afraid of how I would react, still worried that I might be angry or upset or want them to leave and never come back. But I surprised myself by laughing, a real genuine laugh that felt rusty from disuse, and I saw her face transform with relief. "I can't believe," I said, my voice rough from crying. "I can't believe that I've been coming here every Tuesday for 3 years, talking to Emma, telling her about my life, and all this time she was out there still alive in you." I looked at Michael, and he was smiling through his tears, and it was the most beautiful smile I had ever seen, and I felt something that I hadn't felt in 3 years, something I thought I might never feel again, and it took me a moment to recognize it as hope. Michael started talking then, and the words poured out of him like he had been holding them in for too long, like he had been waiting for this moment, for permission to share his story. He told me about the day of the transplant, about waking up after the surgery and feeling different, feeling strong for the first time in his life. He told me about the moment he first learned about organ donation, about how his mother, Jennifer's sister, had explained to him that he had received a gift from a little girl who had died, a little girl who had given him a second chance at life. He told me about his nightmares in those first months, about dreaming of a girl with blonde hair and blue eyes who would come to him and tell him to be brave, and how his doctors said it was just the trauma and the medications. But he knew, he swears he knew, that it was Emma somehow reaching out to him across whatever divide separates the living from the dead. "I looked her up," Michael admitted, his voice dropping to almost a whisper, like he was confessing something he thought might upset me. "I found her name in the transplant records, and I searched online, and I found her obituary, and I saw her picture, and I was right. The girl in my dreams was your daughter. She looked exactly like I had seen her." He paused, searching my face for a reaction, and I just nodded, encouraging him to continue, because I wanted to hear everything, wanted to know every detail of this impossible, improbable connection. "I started learning everything I could about her," he continued. "I read that she loved sunflowers and astronomy and reading, that she wanted to be a scientist when she grew up, that she had a cat named Mr. Whiskers, and I felt like I needed to know her, needed to understand the person whose heart was keeping me alive." Jennifer added that Michael had become obsessed with astronomy after the transplant, had never shown any interest before, but suddenly couldn't get enough information about stars and planets and the universe. He had begged for a telescope for his 8th birthday, spent hours staring up at the night sky, and she had thought it was just a phase until Michael told her about the dreams, about Emma telling him to look up at the stars when he felt scared. "She used to tell me," Michael said, looking up at me with those intense eyes, "she used to say in my dreams that the stars were like hearts, that they shine their light across huge distances even after they're gone, and that her heart was doing the same thing, shining its light inside me, reaching across the distance from wherever she is." The poetry of it, the strange beauty of this child's understanding, made my throat tight with emotion, and I thought about all the nights I had spent looking up at the stars myself, thinking about Emma, wondering if there was anything after death, if she was somewhere out there looking down at me. Comment below if you've ever felt a connection to someone you've never met, someone whose life touched yours in ways you couldn't explain. I know it sounds impossible. I know it sounds like the plot of some sentimental movie, but I'm telling you that standing there in that cemetery, listening to this boy talk about my daughter like he knew her, like they had some bond that transcended the physical reality of what had happened. I believed him. I believed every word. And more than that, I felt it. Felt that Emma was somehow present in that moment, that she had brought us together for a reason, that this wasn't just coincidence or chance, but something deeper, something purposeful, something that I needed even if I hadn't known I needed it. I asked them to walk with me, and we left Emma's grave and wandered through the cemetery, past rows of headstones marking other lives, other losses, other stories of love and grief and everything in between. Jennifer told me about her own journey, about how being in the emergency room that night had changed her, how she had been on the verge of quitting nursing because the job was too hard, too painful, too full of loss and failure. But something about Emma had made her stay. She told me that she had held my daughter's hand in those final moments, had talked to her even though the doctors said she probably couldn't hear anything anymore, had told her that she was going to help save lives, that her gift would mean something, that she wouldn't be forgotten. I made her a promise, Jennifer said, and her voice was thick with emotion again. I promised her that I would take care of whoever received her heart, that I would make sure they knew what an incredible gift they had been given, that they would honor her memory by living fully, by being brave, by making their life count for something. And she had kept that promise, had tracked down the recipients of Emma's organs through the transplant coordinator, had written letters to them all, had received responses from some and silence from others, but Michael was the one she had focused on, because he was family, because she could be there for him in ways she couldn't for the strangers who had received the other organs. She told me about helping Michael through the rejection scares, the infections, the setbacks that came in that first year, about how they had almost lost him twice, but each time he had pulled through, and she swore it was Emma's heart fighting for him, refusing to give up. Michael showed me the bracelet he wore, a simple leather band with a small sunflower charm attached, and he told me he never took it off, wore it in memory of the girl whose heart beat in his chest. He told me about the journal he kept, where he wrote letters to Emma, telling her about his life, his fears, his dreams, thanking her for the gift she had given him. He asked if maybe, someday, I might want to read it, and I nodded, unable to speak, overwhelmed by the generosity of this child, by his understanding of the magnitude of what had happened, by his desire to honor Emma's memory in every way he could. He told me he tried to live 2 lives' worth of experiences, tried to do things for both of them, tried to make every day count because he knew that Emma had been robbed of all the days she should have had, and he felt responsible for living them in her place. We sat on a bench under a willow tree, and I found myself telling them about Emma, really telling them, in a way I hadn't been able to talk about her in 3 years. I told them about the day she was born, how she had come out screaming with indignation at being pulled from the warm safety of the womb, how she had these huge blue eyes that seemed to see everything, how I had fallen in love with her instantly and completely in a way I had never loved anything or anyone before. I told them about her first words, her first steps, the way she would narrate everything she was doing in this constant stream of consciousness that drove Sarah and me crazy, but that we also secretly loved. I told them about her obsession with bugs, how she would spend hours in the backyard turning over rocks and logs to see what was underneath, how she had no fear of spiders or worms or anything that crawled, how she would bring them inside to show us and we would have to gently explain that insects belonged outside. I told them about the accident, something I had never spoken about in detail to anyone, not even Sarah, not even the therapist I had seen briefly before giving up on therapy altogether. It had been a Saturday afternoon, and I was supposed to be watching her, but I had gotten a call from work, some crisis that seemed important at the time but that I couldn't even remember now, and I had let my attention wander. Emma had been riding her bike in the driveway, wearing her helmet like we had taught her, staying in the safe zone we had marked out, but there had been a ball, her favorite ball that had rolled into the street, and she had gone after it without thinking, the way 7-year-olds do, without considering consequences or danger or anything except retrieving that ball. The car had come around the corner too fast, the driver had been texting, hadn't seen her until it was too late, and the sound of the impact, that terrible, sickening sound, was something I still heard in my nightmares, would probably hear for the rest of my life. I told them about the hospital, about the doctors who had worked on her for hours trying to reduce the swelling in her brain, about the scans that showed the damage was too extensive, about the choice Sarah and I had to make about whether to keep her on life support or let her go, about how we had both known, even as we prayed for a miracle, that our little girl was already gone, that the body in that hospital bed with all the tubes and machines was just an empty shell, that Emma, our vibrant, curious, joyful Emma had already left us. And I told them about the decision to donate her organs, about how the transplant coordinator had explained the process, had told us that Emma could save multiple lives, could give other children and adults a second chance, and how that had been the only thing that made any sense, the only way to find any meaning in the meaningless tragedy that had stolen our daughter from us. I signed the papers, I said, and my voice was barely audible now, but I never really thought about what it meant. I never thought about the people who would receive her organs, never thought about the fact that her heart would keep beating, that it would keep some other child alive. I couldn't think about it because it felt too strange, too uncomfortable, like I was giving pieces of her away to strangers. And even though I knew it was the right thing to do, I couldn't. I couldn't let myself imagine it. I looked at Michael, at this boy who had been a complete stranger an hour ago, but who now felt like something else, something I didn't have words for, and I felt a wave of gratitude so intense it almost knocked me over. But seeing you, I continued, knowing that Emma's heart is in you, that it's keeping you alive, that you're honoring her memory the way you are, it makes it real in a way it never was before. And I don't know how to explain this, but it makes the loss hurt less somehow. It makes it feel like she's not completely gone. Do you know what it feels like to discover that something you thought was lost forever is actually still here, just in a different form? That's what I felt in that moment, and it was overwhelming and beautiful and terrifying all at once. Jennifer was crying again, quietly this time, and Michael had moved closer to me on the bench, close enough that our shoulders were touching, and I put my arm around him without thinking about it, and he leaned into me like it was the most natural thing in the world. And we sat there in silence for a long time, just breathing, just being, just existing in this new reality that none of us had anticipated, but that felt somehow inevitable, like it had been waiting to happen all along. Time passed differently after that morning, measured not in the empty hours between visits to Emma's grave, but in the growing relationship between Michael, Jennifer, and me. We exchanged phone numbers before leaving the cemetery that day, and I made them promise to stay in touch. Made Michael promise that he would let me know how he was doing, that he wouldn't disappear from my life now that I had found him. Jennifer had been hesitant at first, worried about overstepping boundaries, worried about causing me more pain, but I had assured her that this was what I needed, what I wanted, that knowing about Michael didn't diminish my grief for Emma, but somehow made it more bearable, gave it a context and meaning it hadn't had before. The first few weeks were awkward as we figured out how to navigate this strange new connection, but slowly, tentatively, we built something that resembled a relationship. I started having dinner with Michael and Jennifer every Friday night, would pick them up from their modest apartment across town and take them to different restaurants, and Michael would tell me about school, about his friends, about the astronomy club he had joined, about the science fair project he was working on. I would listen, fascinated by this boy who carried my daughter's heart, looking for traces of Emma in his interests and mannerisms, sometimes finding them in the oddest moments, in the way he tilted his head when he was thinking, in his love of bad puns, in his fierce loyalty to the people he cared about. Jennifer told me more about the night of Emma's accident, filling in details that I had never known, that the hospital hadn't shared with us in the immediate aftermath. She told me that Emma had been awake when she first arrived, had been conscious and scared and calling for me, and that Jennifer had held her hand and told her that her daddy was coming, that everything would be okay, even as she knew that the injuries were catastrophic. She told me that Emma had asked her if she was going to die, and Jennifer had lied, had said, "No, of course not. You're going to be fine." Because what else could you say to a terrified 7-year-old who was bleeding internally and whose skull had been fractured in multiple places? She told me that Emma's last words, before she lost consciousness for the final time, had been, "Tell my daddy I'm sorry." And that confession broke something open in me that I hadn't known was still closed. Because Emma had nothing to be sorry for, nothing at all. And the fact that she had spent her last conscious moments feeling guilty about something that was entirely my fault made me want to scream at the unfairness of it all. I started therapy again, at Jennifer's gentle insistence, and this time I actually engaged with the process instead of sitting in the therapist's office, counting down the minutes until I could leave. I talked about the guilt, about the what-ifs that had consumed me for 3 years, about how I had blamed myself for every second of every day since the accident. The therapist helped me understand that grief was not linear, that there was no right way to mourn, that the anger I felt toward myself was normal but not productive, that I needed to find a way to forgive myself if I ever wanted to move forward. It was hard, brutally hard, but knowing Michael, seeing what Emma's death had made possible, gave me a reason to try. gave me something to work toward beyond just existing day to day. Michael's mother, Jennifer's sister Rachel, was understandably wary of me at first when Jennifer told her about our meeting at the cemetery. She was protective of her son, worried that I might be unstable, that I might hurt Michael emotionally by viewing him as a replacement for Emma or by rejecting him if he didn't live up to some impossible standard. But Jennifer vouched for me, and eventually Rachel agreed to meet me, and we had an awkward, emotional lunch where I tried to explain that I didn't see Michael as Emma, that I understood he was his own person with his own life, but that I felt connected to him in a way I couldn't fully explain and didn't want to ignore. Rachel had been skeptical, but as the weeks turned into months and she saw how happy Michael was to have me in his life, how much he looked forward to our Friday dinners and weekend outings, she softened, and we developed our own tentative friendship based on our mutual love for this remarkable boy. Michael's health was not perfect, would probably never be perfect, and there were scares that reminded me how fragile this gift was, how temporary everything could be. There was a night 6 months after we met when Jennifer called me at 3 a.m. to tell me Michael was in the hospital with signs of rejection, that his body might be attacking the transplanted heart, that they were running tests and adjusting medications, and we wouldn't know for several hours if the crisis would pass. I drove to the hospital still in my pajamas, breaking every speed limit, my mind going to dark places I didn't want to explore, and I found Jennifer and Rachel in the waiting room, both of them pale and terrified. And we held on to each other while the doctors worked on Michael, while Emma's heart fought to keep beating in his chest, while we all prayed to whatever might be listening that we wouldn't lose him too. He pulled through, as he had every other time. And when I was finally allowed to see him, weak and tired in his hospital bed with monitors beeping around him, he smiled at me and said, "She's still fighting for me. I can feel her. She won't let me go." And I believed him, believed that somehow Emma's spirit or essence or whatever part of us survives death was still present in that heart, still protecting Michael, still serving its purpose of keeping someone alive even though her own life had ended. The doctors credited the quick intervention and medication adjustments. And maybe they were right. Maybe it was just medical science doing what medical science does. But I chose to believe Michael's version, chose to believe that my daughter was still fighting, still refusing to give up, still making a difference in the world 3 years after her death. I took Michael to the planetarium for his 10th birthday, rented out the whole place for the evening so we could have a private showing in the Dome Theater, and we lay back in the seats and watched the stars wheel across the artificial sky while the narrator explained the constellations, the galaxies, the vast incomprehensible scope of the universe. Michael was entranced, his hand in mine, his eyes wide with wonder, and afterward he told me it was the best birthday he had ever had, and I felt a surge of something that might have been pride or love or gratitude or all of those things mixed together. We stood outside afterward, looking up at the real stars now, and Michael said, "Do you think Emma can see us from wherever she is? Do you think she knows we're here together?" And I told him yes, absolutely yes, she can see us. She knows. She's happy that we found each other, and I meant it, believed it with everything in me, because I had to believe that this connection, this improbable, impossible relationship, was part of some larger plan, some purpose that made Emma's death mean something, beyond just random tragedy. ¿Te ha pasado algo que cambió completamente tu forma de ver la vida? I started to change after that year with Michael. Started to become a different person. Or maybe started to become the person I was supposed to be before grief had frozen me in place. I sold my company, something I had never imagined doing, because the endless pursuit of money and success that had once driven me seemed empty and pointless now, seemed like a waste of the limited time we all have on this earth. I used part of the proceeds to set up a foundation in Emma's name, focused on supporting families dealing with pediatric organ transplants, providing financial assistance, counseling services, educational resources, everything I wished had been available to Michael's family, everything I could do to honor my daughter's memory by helping others in similar situations. Jennifer left her emergency room position to come work for the foundation, using her medical expertise and her personal understanding of what families were going through to shape our programs and services. Michael became our unofficial ambassador, speaking at events when he felt up to it, sharing his story with other transplant recipients, offering hope to children on waiting lists and their desperate parents. Watching him stand in front of crowds, telling them about Emma, about the gift she had given him, about how every day was precious and important because it was a day he almost didn't have. I felt a pride that I hadn't felt since the last time I watched Emma in her school play, since the last time I saw her receive a certificate for reading achievement, since the last time I experienced the particular joy of watching a child I loved accomplish something difficult and meaningful. The second anniversary of meeting Michael at Emma's grave, I brought him back to the cemetery, and we stood together in front of her headstone, and he read aloud from the journal he had been keeping, letters to Emma thanking her for his life, telling her about all the things he had done because of her gift, promising to make the most of every moment he had been given. I placed sunflowers on her grave as I still did every Tuesday, but this time Michael added his own flowers, white roses like the ones he had brought that first day, and we stood there together, our hands joined, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 5 years, something that felt almost like peace, almost like acceptance, almost like the beginning of healing. Rachel remarried that year, a kind man named David who worked as a teacher and who loved Michael like his own son, and I stood in the back at their wedding, watching this family that had become my family celebrate their happiness, and I felt genuinely joyful for them, felt none of the bitterness or envy I might have felt before Michael, before I understood that love doesn't diminish when it's shared, but actually grows, actually multiplies, actually becomes more than it was. Michael asked me to dance at the reception, and I twirled him around the dance floor, this small, brave boy with Emma's heart beating in his chest, and I whispered to him, "Thank you for letting me be part of your life," and he whispered back, "Thank you for giving me mine." I reconnected with Sarah, my ex-wife, and told her about Michael, and at first she didn't want to know, didn't want to hear about it, because her way of coping had been to close that chapter completely, to move forward and not look back, but eventually she agreed to meet him, and I watched her face as she put her hand on his chest and felt Emma's heart beating there, and I saw her expression crumble and reform, saw something shift in her eyes, and afterward she told me that she had needed to know that some part of Emma was still alive in the world. We didn't get back together. Too much had changed for that to be possible. But we found a new kind of relationship built on shared memories and shared love for the daughter we had lost and for the boy who carried her heart. I started speaking too, accepting invitations to talk about organ donation, about the importance of having those difficult conversations with family members before tragedy strikes, about how one person's death can save and improve multiple lives if we're willing to make that choice. I told Emma's story and Michael's story everywhere I went, to high schools and colleges, to medical conferences and community groups, to anyone who would listen, because I had learned that stories have power, that they can change minds and hearts, that they can turn tragedy into meaning if we're willing to share them. Every time I spoke, I wore a small sunflower pin on my lapel, Emma's favorite flower, and people would ask me about it, and I would tell them about my daughter who loved astronomy and bad jokes, and looking under rocks for bugs, about my daughter whose heart was still beating 3 years after her death, about my daughter who had taught me that love doesn't end when life ends, that it continues, transforms, finds new ways to exist in the world. Michael's health continued to be fragile, and there were more scares, more hospital visits, more nights when I sat in waiting rooms praying that Emma's heart would keep fighting, that it would keep Michael alive for another day, another week, another year. Each time he pulled through, each time the crisis passed, I felt grateful and terrified in equal measure. Grateful that we still had him, but terrified that the next time might be different, that the heart that had been beating strong for 6 years might finally give out, might finally fail, and I would lose this connection to Emma that had become so precious to me. But Michael remained optimistic, remained convinced that Emma was protecting him, that she wouldn't let him go until he had lived enough for both of them, and his faith, his absolute certainty that he was meant to survive, gave all of us strength during the dark times. On what would have been Emma's 13th birthday, I organized a special event at the foundation, a celebration of life and love and the incredible gift of organ donation. We invited all the families we had helped, all the recipients and donors we knew, and we shared stories in tears and laughter. And Michael stood up and spoke about Emma, about the sister he had never met but who he felt he knew better than anyone, about the girl whose heart had given him a life he wouldn't have had otherwise, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Afterward, we released biodegradable balloons into the sky, each one carrying a message of hope or gratitude, and I watched them rise into the blue expanse, watched them catch the wind and scatter in all directions, and I thought about how that was what Emma's death had done, had scattered hope and life in all directions, had touched more people than she ever could have if she had lived a normal lifespan. I'm not going to tell you that everything was perfect after that finding Michael magically healed all my grief and made everything okay, because that wouldn't be true and you deserve the truth. I still had hard days. Days when I missed Emma so much I could barely breathe. Days when I went to the cemetery and sat by her grave and cried like I had cried in those first weeks after her death. I still felt guilty about the accident, still replayed that day in my mind and wondered what would have happened if I hadn't taken that phone call, if I had been paying closer attention, if I had somehow prevented Emma from chasing that ball into the street. The therapist told me I might always carry that guilt, that it might be something I would have to learn to live with, rather than something that would ever fully go away. And I was learning to accept that, to understand that the guilt was part of my love for Emma, was proof that she had mattered, that her life had meant something. But having Michael in my life changed the equation somehow, made the grief more bearable because it wasn't just about loss anymore, but also about continuation, about legacy, about the way love can transform and persist even in the face of death. I started to understand what the nurse had meant when she said Emma was special, that she had fought hard even at the end, because her heart was still fighting, still doing what hearts do, still pumping life through someone's body, still making everything possible. I started to see Emma not as a tragedy, but as a gift, both to me during the 7 years I had her, and to Michael and others for whatever time they had with the organs she had donated. And that shift in perspective, that ability to see beyond just my own loss to the larger picture, was maybe the most important thing I learned in all of this. So here I am now, telling you this story, hoping that maybe it will resonate with you, maybe it will make you think about organ donation in a new way. Maybe it will help you understand that even in our darkest moments, there can be light if we're willing to look for it, if we're willing to accept it when it comes in unexpected forms. Michael is 13 now, the same age Emma would have been, and he's thriving, doing well in school, talking about becoming a doctor someday so he can save lives the way his life was saved, the way Emma saved him. Jennifer is engaged to a wonderful man she met through the foundation, and she tells me all the time that meeting me in that cemetery changed her life too, gave her purpose and meaning beyond just her work, reminded her why she became a nurse in the first place. And me? I'm different than I was 6 years ago, different than I was that morning when I drove to the cemetery expecting just another sad Tuesday morning ritual, and found instead these two people crying at my daughter's grave. I'm not the same man who lost himself in grief and business and the empty pursuit of success that meant nothing. I've learned to live again, to find joy in small moments, to appreciate the fragility and preciousness of every single day we're given. I've learned that love doesn't die when people die, that it continues in ways we can't predict or control, that it finds new forms and new expressions if we're open to them. I've learned that my daughter's death, as terrible and unfair as it was, made something beautiful possible, saved a life, created connections that enriched multiple families, started a foundation that has helped hundreds of other families navigate similar tragedies. I want you to understand something really important here. This isn't just some sentimental story about making the best of a bad situation. What happened with Michael, what I discovered at Emma's grave that day, fundamentally changed my understanding of what life and death mean, of how we're all connected in ways we don't see or understand until something happens to reveal those connections. When I looked at the organ donation form 6 years ago, signing away my daughter's organs, I had no idea what I was really doing, no conception of the ripple effects that choice would have. No understanding that I was creating possibilities for healing, not just for recipients like Michael, but for myself too, for Jennifer, for everyone who has been touched by Emma's story. If you're watching this and you've been through something similar, if you've lost someone you love and you're struggling to find meaning in that loss, I want you to know that it's okay to grieve. It's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel like the world is fundamentally unfair and cruel. But I also want you to know that grief can coexist with joy. That loss doesn't have to be the end of the story, that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the most unexpected sources. If you've experienced something like this, if you've been touched by organ donation either as a recipient or a donor family, please share your story in the comments below. These stories matter. They help people understand the importance of this choice. They give hope to families on waiting lists. They honor the memories of those who gave the ultimate gift. And if you haven't thought about organ donation before, I'm asking you to think about it now. Have that conversation with your family. Make your wishes known. Sign up to be a donor if you're not already one, because you never know when tragedy might strike. You never know when you might have the opportunity to save lives the way Emma saved Michael's life, the way she saved mine in a different way by giving me a reason to keep going, a connection to her that I never expected to have. The decision you make today could mean the difference between life and death for someone like Michael, could mean the difference between complete despair and hope for a family like mine. I need you to really hear this. To understand the importance of what I'm saying, organ donation isn't just about the physical transfer of organs from one body to another. It's about the continuation of love, the persistence of life, the connections that bind us all together as human beings. It's about choosing hope over despair, about choosing to make meaning out of tragedy, about choosing to believe that even when the worst happens, something beautiful can still emerge from the ashes. Emma's heart is still beating 6 years after her death, still fighting, still living. And that's not just a medical miracle. It's a testament to the power of human generosity, human compassion, human love. If this story touched your heart, if it made you cry or think or feel something deep, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people see this story, helps spread the message about organ donation, helps honor Emma's memory and the memories of all the other donors who have given this incredible gift. Subscribe to Through My Eyes for more stories like this, real stories about real people dealing with real challenges and finding real hope in the midst of heartbreak. These are the stories that matter, the stories that remind us we're not alone, the stories that help us understand each other and ourselves better. And please hit that notification bell so you don't miss future videos. I share stories every week about extraordinary moments in ordinary lives, about the connections that bind us, about the love that persists even when everything seems lost. Your comments, your likes, your subscriptions, they all matter. They tell me that these stories are reaching people, that they're making a difference, that Emma's story and Michael's story and my story are helping others navigate their own journeys through grief and loss and hopefully toward healing. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for caring enough to watch this whole video. Thank you for being part of this community where we share our truths, our vulnerabilities, our hopes, and our heartbreaks. Remember, every day is a gift, every moment matters, and love never truly dies. It just transforms into something new, something we might not recognize at first, but that can be just as beautiful, just as profound, just as life-changing as the original. Michael taught me that, Emma taught me that, and now I'm passing that lesson on to you.